welcome to the Human Being Human. This is the Human Being Human Pod. This is the Human Being Human Pod. This is the Human Being Welcome Pod to the Human Being Human Podcast. This is the Human Being Human Podcast.
Anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. This quote by Nebraska author Willa Cather summed up a feeling that I had been unable to articulate during a weekend road trip through western Nebraska with my wife Danielle. Honestly, this feeling has been in the back of my mind and on the tip of my tongue my entire life. Perhaps others listening feel the same way. The state of Nebraska is not a place of dramatic scenery. Many that travel through it cannot enjoy or appreciate its subtle, subdued, and understated natural beauty, and understandably so. How can tiny streams compare to oceans, marshy wetlands to giant canyons, or grassy hills to rocky mountains? As someone who's lived alongside the Rocky Mountains for the last 5 years, I've been able to view these deep-rooted questions from clearer vantage points. And as I unearth more answers, I find myself growing more and more nostalgic and immensely appreciative of the state that I still call my home. I grew up in a lush river valley, nestled between rolling grassy hills, and aptly named Valley County, Nebraska. My town of Ord, Nebraska, like 89% of the towns in the state, had fewer than 3,000 people, 2,093 by last count. I lived on a farm a few miles from town, like many of my fellow friends, family, and classmates. If I were to walk down my driveway into the sandhills, I wouldn't have crossed a single road, gravel or otherwise, for 4 uninterrupted miles. Not that I ever did, but I always knew that I could. Immersing ourselves in this rich environment was instinctual and came by easily. Our friends and I camped along lakes and in our backyards and on top of silage piles, beneath lightning storms, thunderheads, and some of the clearest night skies any human being can see on planet Earth. Nebraska may not be what some think of dramatic scenery today, but it had more than its fair share millions and millions of years ago. Nebraska is a primordial place, filled with the fossils of dinosaurs and ancient sea creatures of legend and lore. As kids growing up traveling across the state on class field trips, us youngsters got to see the bones, skeletons, and teeth of these archaic beings, including the remains of mammoths and mastodons, woolly rhinos and saber-toothed cats, and extinct camels and horses. Beneath the endless rows of corn and open pasture land, Nebraska truly is a lost world. My home state is a place of change, dynamics, and transformation. From its prehistoric past of lava, oceans, and sprawling forests, to its slushy mix of snowstorms, sunshine, and tornadoes today, Nebraska is not a place for Southern Californians. Except for this Southern Californian, who moved to the state when I was just 5 years old. From the ever-changing weather, the colors of the seasons, to the length of the night and day, the relationship that Nebraskans have to their state is one of constant back and forth with Mother Nature, and Brother Nature, and Grandma Nature, really the whole nature family. Each and every year, all of us look forward to the golden orange and browns of autumn, the stark and silent whites of winter, and the vivid greens of spring and summer. From the smells of pool water and freshly cut grass, to the sound of snow shovels and blistering winds, to the taste of canned pears and sliced cucumbers, treasures for the senses are in no short supply. We brace ourselves for sudden evening thunderstorms, and we embrace the calming stillness during those dead January nights. My state can be anything and everything, anytime, anywhere, and has a little bit we can all love. That is, if you have a soul. Nebraska. Honestly, it's for everybody. Welcome to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. If you made it this far and decided this podcast isn't for you, I appreciate you making it this far. Of all the subjects to do, why am I doing a podcast series on Nebraska? A quick interweb search quickly reveals there isn't much content when it comes to Nebraska-themed podcasts, or Nebraska-themed anything for that matter. Perhaps this can be my whole justification. Like a noble gas, I will fill the empty void. Hopefully by the end of this series, you'll have a better understanding of my connection to this place. It may be flyover country, as they say, but I happen to think it's pretty fly. This podcast is about relationships, and the relationship to one's home is one of the most fundamental to human beings. My home of Nebraska is a place of common experiences. The majority of those that live here have ties and connections that bind us together into the communities we all cherish. Almost without exception, Nebraskans must rely on the land and the sea, the rivers and the grasslands, and on our friends, families, and the people around us we work with and care about. We enjoy feasting during harvest time, supporting our favorite sports teams, namely the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and coming together during good times when we want to, and bad times when we're needed. Because that's what human beings do. Instead of relying primarily on books for this series of episodes, we'll be using the internet as our primary medium of research and information gathering. This is a testament to the amount of free access to public information that's provided by the state of Nebraska and its academic institutions, as well as federally funded educational programs such as NPR and PBS. When I can, I'll attempt to focus in and localize this story to my home of Valley County and hometown of Ord, Nebraska. The amount of archival information available on my family and local history is quite impressive, and would be very difficult to find physical copies of such archives and records. Once again, this is thanks to the power of public education and open access to information. To understand and gain perspective on the Great Plains, a rich, biodiverse region of over 500,000 square miles, we need to know how and why this ocean of grass and prairie formed here in the first place. We'll have to look at paleogeography, paleontology, paleobotany, and a host of many other paleos. My state's timeline will take us through lava and volcanoes, oceans and seas, jungles and savannas, and we'll leave off our story today with ice, glaciers, and frozen tundra. Before the end of this episode, we'll become very familiar with my state's prehistoric past, long before the first Nebraskans arrived. We'll travel through soil and rocks, across primordial seas, and into the earliest days of the Great Plains, where we'll see the mysterious animals that once roamed and prowled the state of Nebraska. How can flyover country have such a rich and diverse geological past? How did sharks and dinosaurs and other strange and unlikely animals arrive here, of all places? The story of Nebraska's prehistory is the story of continents, plate tectonics, and the theory of continental drift. For those unfamiliar, this is the theory that the Earth's continents are slowly moving apart and together over time, lots of time, thus appearing to drift across the ocean bed into their present configuration. This is why Africa and South America appear to have been connected at one point long ago. As with most scientific principles we completely take for granted today, this idea was highly controversial when initially proposed barely a century ago in 1912. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s, when submarine technology was finally advanced enough, that scientists and oceanographers could explore the deepest ocean floors for the first time, which allowed them to confirm the concept and theory of continental drift. By seeing and studying firsthand the rifts and Earth-sized zippers that run across the ocean floor, human beings could finally see the puzzle piece-like configuration that is the makeup of planet Earth. One of the common threads in this podcast is that part of the progress of science has always been, and it seems will always be, that fringe science can eventually become accepted science. Not always flat earthers and anti-vaxxers, and not always. But there are many, many examples of ideas and hypotheses and theories that were once considered lunacy that most kindergartners could tell you today. The sun is the center of the solar system. An asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. The continents move across the ocean. So on and so forth. There will always be those folks on the outskirts of science who may one day be on the inside. Not always, I want to emphasize, but there are many more examples in the history of science that cannot be contained in this podcast. The theory of continental drift was one of these lunatic ideas. Who were these fringe lunatics on the edges of reality, claiming that the continents are floating on oceans of melted rock? One name stands prominently at the center of history. Alfred Wegener, born November 1st, 1880 in Berlin, Germany, was a meteorologist and geophysicist. During his life and career, he was primarily known for his pioneering accomplishments in meteorology and polar research, prophetically passing away on an expedition to Greenland in 1930. Today, he is most remembered as offering the first and complete theory of continental drift. In the year 1912, Wegener published The Origins of Continents, in which he postulated that the continents are slowly drifting around the Earth on plate tectonics. He based this hypothesis on the shape of the land and the strange discrepancy of fossils scattered about the globe. He was also the first to propose the idea of supercontinents, naming the first and what he thought was the only, Pangaea. How crazy of an idea is that? That all of the continents are floating on top of each other and are slowly drifting and colliding into one another? Pure lunacy. Let's dig further down into the theory of continental drift and its significance to the story of Nebraska. We're all familiar with the supercontinent Pangaea, which was originated and named by Alfred Wegener. Most of us recognize this name because Pangaea was the most recent supercontinent to have existed, and the first to be historically reconstructed by geologists with reasonable accuracy. Overall, though, scientists have evidence that 10 to 12 supercontinents have existed over Earth's lifetime, and there will certainly be more in the distant future. For a more in-depth insight into the fascinating history of Earth's supercontinents, I highly recommend the channel PBS Eons and their video, The Whole Saga of the Supercontinents. Free public education? Now that's lunacy with a capital L. The piece of Earth that is Nebraska formed long, long ago, between 1.6 and 1.8 billion years ago. That land today is part of what is known as the North American Craton, or core of the North American continent. Continental cores, or cratons, are very solid and stable because they were some of the first foundational pieces of land ever formed on Earth. Many times in the past, this core part of North America was once its own separate continent as well, known as Laurentia, which also included parts of Greenland and Scotland, before forming the North American continent as we know and see it today. So now that we understand continental drift a bit clearer, This can help us answer the question that fascinated me when I was a child. How did sharks and plesiosaurs and other ancient water creatures arrive in Nebraska, of all places? During the late Cretaceous period, between 66 million and 99 million years ago, 3/4 of Nebraska was covered by a shallow saltwater sea called the Western Interior Seaway, a large body of water that covered 1/3 of the United States in total. On a map, it would have looked as if the U.S. was torn right in half around Texas, with the Gulf of Mexico flooding up in a giant rift that smothered the Midwest all the way through the Arctic Ocean. Of course, the great geological and tectonic forces that are responsible for these massive movements of land and water lie at the core, pardon the pun, of continental drift. Not only do we find the preserved remains of the strange creatures that once swam these seas, we can also see evidence of them in the layers of the land itself. Fossil skeletons of the animals and plants that lived during this time were embedded into the mud long ago, which then hardened into rock, and then became the limestone that appears today on the sides of ravines and along the streams of Nebraska. All of us grew up playing and exploring the soil and the dirt. We just might not have known what we were holding between our hands. Some of these geological layers are prominent enough to have names some listeners might be familiar with. The Niobrara Formation, also called the Niobrara Chalk, is a geologic layer in the strata found in North America that was deposited between 87 and 82 million years ago during the late Cretaceous period. The type locality for which the Niobrara Chalk is named after is located in Knox County in northeastern Nebraska, which contains the towns of Verdigris and, of course, Niobrara. As a dinosaur geek now and, of course, growing up, Nebraska was a prime place to spend my childhood exploring our state's paleontology. Sadly, though, there haven't been any discoveries in my hometown or county I grew up in. Yet. But in Nebraska, there have certainly been many fossil discoveries of sea creatures that lived in the Western Interior Seaway. Although these are technically speaking not dinosaurs, quote, but giant swimming reptiles, commonly they're all seen and lumped together with dinosaurs. The kind of land-living dinosaurs we would all recognize would have lived on the eastern coast of the Western Interior Seaway, which would be modern-day eastern Nebraska, along the border of South Dakota. Unfortunately, the harsh lands and acidic soils these animals occupied millions of years ago did not create favorable conditions for fossils to be preserved. Instead, their skeletons disintegrated and vanished into the layers of dirt and earth, with only a couple of rare specimens surviving until this day. One of Nebraska's most notable discoveries goes by the name the Valparaiso plesiosaur, which some listeners may recognize. The Loch Ness Monster of Scotland, which interestingly shared the same continent that Nebraska did long ago, is famously thought to be an undiscovered plesiosaur, which seems borderline conspiratorial in my opinion. The Valparaiso plesiosaur is one of paleontology's best examples of this long-necked creature, with complete bones measuring at 21 feet 8 inches long, the world's biggest find. If alive, the entire animal would have spanned over 40 feet in length. As the name implies, this find was made in 1964 near Valparaiso, Nebraska, in Saunders County, on the Adolph Resnick farm. Credit to this find goes to geologists Charles Osborne, Hal DeGraw, and Phil Emery, who were studying outcrops of gray shale along the North Oak Creek near the farm. After they noticed large vertebrae and paddle bones sticking out from the stream bank, they notified the Lincoln Gem and Mineral Club. With the dedicated help of 22 volunteers digging in sub-zero temperatures, the skeleton was eventually excavated and brought to the museum for preparation and display. Today, the Valparaiso plesiosaur can still be seen at the Nebraska State Museum on 14th Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. If anybody listening has ever seen the 2015 motion picture Jurassic World, the next major discovery may look familiar as well. The mosasaur. Mosasaurs, although they lived at the same time of dinosaurs, were true lizards, closely related to the monitor lizard family of today, including the Komodo dragons of Indonesia. These swimming lizards, however, grew much larger, to lengths of 30 to 60 feet or more. In 1987, the largest known mosasaur fossil in Nebraska, measuring 33 feet long, was discovered in Niobrara State Park, located on the confluence of the Missouri and Niobrara rivers. Credit to this find belongs to John Morganson and Steve Bray, horticulturalists for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. These two men were planting trees along an access road near a cabin development in the park when they noticed several large fossils sticking out of a nearby hillside. The skull was in an amazing state of preservation. Even fragile structures, like the ring of bones inside the grapefruit-sized eyeball, were still intact after 80 million years below the ground. Just like the Valparaiso plesiosaur, the Niobrara mosasaur resides at the Nebraska State Museum on 14th Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. Because the majority of Nebraska was once underwater, fossil remains of sea reptiles are much more common than land-dwelling dinosaurs, which are unfortunately much more rare. And so I'd like to discuss the only two major dinosaur discoveries ever found in Nebraska. Yet. Although dinosaur fossils have been excavated and cataloged through the millennia, thought to be the bones of dragons, giants, and other mysterious creatures, they weren't scientifically classified until 1824, and weren't formally named dinosaurs until 1842. Almost a century later, the first dinosaur discovery was made in Nebraska in 1928, the year before my grandparents were born. The honor of this first discovery goes to J.B. White of Decatur, Nebraska, who found the lower end of a huge thigh bone on his farm in northwestern Burt County near the Missouri River. My wife's grandmother also grew up on a farm near Decatur, Nebraska, although she didn't find any dinosaur bones that I know of. After digging the bone up, J.B. hauled the 65-pound fossil to Lincoln and donated it to the museum at his alma mater, the University of Nebraska, class of 1899. The paleontologists who have analyzed the bone agree that it belongs to an orthopod, meaning birdfoot, a plant-eating dinosaur that walked on its huge hind legs millions of years ago. These types of dinosaurs are sometimes described as cow lizards, based on their skeletal remains and likely eating patterns. A fitting name for a creature that lived on the plains of Nebraska. Believe it or not, J.B. White's 1928 discovery can currently be seen on display at the Nebraska State Museum, 14th Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. Many decades passed after J.B. White's find before the next dinosaur discovery, and it wasn't nearly as intact, unfortunately. This find is especially rare and fascinating, though, because the fossil belongs to that of a carnivorous dinosaur. In 1981, 8-year-old Aaron Thornburg found a saw-edged petrified tooth in the road gravel near his home in Lewiston, Nebraska, located in Pawnee County. It's common to find the teeth of Ice Age mammals along gravel roads, whether they're ancient bears, cats, or wolves. But this particular one, however, looked different enough to Aaron's mom, Doris, that she sent it to the University of Nebraska for further analysis and possible identification. It turned out to be a partial tooth of a large carnivorous dinosaur, about halfway in size between a 1.5-ton Allosaurus and a 5-ton Tyrannosaurus. Keep in mind, the initial hypothesis that an asteroid impact killed the dinosaurs in a mass extinction 65 million years ago wasn't proposed until 1980, the year before Aaron's lucky find. Although I can't confirm it, it's likely safe to assume that this rare saw-edged tooth resides at the Nebraska State Museum on 14th Street in, you guessed it, Lincoln, Nebraska. Everything on planet Earth changed 65 million years ago, as we all know. Massive geological changes, both internal and external, closed off the western interior seaway, and conditions gave way for new environments to form. Oceans that once covered Nebraska would slowly become oceans of prairie. It wasn't long after the dinosaurs disappeared that grass began to evolve 55 million years ago. By 25 million years ago, the climate became favorable for the evolution of grasslands, the origins of the Great Plains. The lush and tropical jungle biomes that existed during the reign of the dinosaurs slowly receded over millions of years, and the great grassland regions of the Midwest became more and more widespread. These ancient prairies provided a new niche for mammals of all sizes and shapes to fill, the kind that captured the imagination of my childhood, and still do to this day. My third grade year was a pivotal and memorable year in my young life. The year was 1997. The movie The Lost World: Jurassic Park was released the summer before, and the class school trip that year couldn't be more opportune to my skyrocketing obsession with all things paleontology. That year, our third grade class visited Ashfall fossil beds, home to some of the most uniquely preserved mammal fossils in the entire world. Ashfall Fossil Beds is located in northeastern Nebraska in Antelope County, which includes the towns of Neely and Oakdale, not too far from where I graduated college, incidentally. Sometimes referred to as Nebraska's Pompeii, Ashfall Fossil Beds contain some of the most perfectly preserved fossils that can be seen anywhere, and their ghostly skeletons can't help but be compared to the frozen ash statues of the people that perished under Mount Vesuvius. Before diving into the extraordinary circumstances that allowed for this geological snapshot, let's set the scene of what Nebraska looked like after the fall of the dinosaurs and the rise of the mammals. This is the Miocene era, which lasted from 23 million years ago to 5 million years ago. The dominant characteristics of the land at the time would have been flat oceans of grassland, interrupted by shallow stream valleys and large patches of wooded forest. Animals that could be found in Nebraska during the Miocene and at Ashfall fossil beds includes ancient camels and rhinoceroses, wolves and horses, and the mighty and dangerous saber-toothed deer. The climate would have been much warmer and wetter than it is today. Animals living during this era would have never seen snow at any time during their lifetimes. Just like 65 million years ago, all of this changed one day, quickly, rapidly, and with dramatic consequences. Hundreds of miles to the west in present-day Idaho, a huge supervolcano erupted called the Bruno Jar Bridge event. Scientists and geologists estimate that this eruption was more than 100 times greater than the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. The volcanic ash from this colossal event was carried by the winds and across the plains, where it eventually deposited over 1 foot of volcanic ash dust over much of northern Nebraska. The volcanic ash began to blow around like fresh snow, and in a cruel twist, the only snow these animals would ever experience. After some time, the high ground was blown free of this ash, but low-lying areas, like the watering holes found at Ashfall fossil beds, were filled to the depths of 8 feet or more. The scene would have been described as a deadly gray blizzard, which encapsulated camels, rhinoceroses, and dozens of others into their frozen earthly graves. Having an opportunity to see these eerie and ancient watering holes as a young kid is one of the reasons I can say, Nebraska honestly, it's for everybody. And so, after millions of years of drifting from one place to another, after millions of years being engulfed by a shallow inland sea, and after millions of more years being covered with lush forests and savannas, ice will be the next great force that shaped Nebraska. Beginning 2.5 million years ago, the Earth was plunged into a series of ice ages that lasted until only 12,000 years ago. During this time, the Earth's climate repeatedly changed between very cold periods, when glaciers covered large parts of the world, and warmer periods, when many of those glaciers partially melted and retreated. Immense sheets of ice and glaciers emerged from the north and expanded over the land, carving and flattening the terrain below it without mercy. It was during this treacherous and dynamic period that the earliest people to enter Nebraska for the first time, calling this place of flat water home. Thanks once again, everybody, for listening to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your host and creator, Carrington Cooper. Please join me for the next episode, and we'll see each other on the other side. You can follow this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, as well as Patreon. I'll be posting links to all of the references mentioned throughout this series, as well as any other cool videos, stories, articles, or anything that might be of interest. I would like to extend a special thanks to the Lower Loop for providing today's music, a beautiful and wonderful song called Lullaby for Nebraska. And on that note, I would like to wish everybody a good morning, a good day, and a good night. We'll see you next time.